Okay, thanks very much, Mary. Yeah, welcome everybody. Pretty excited to host this very timely webinar today. I thought we'd kick it off by starting with our Southern Hemisphere guests, and then perhaps we'll give Jeremy another 10 or 15 minutes to have a coffee, because I know it's pretty early in the morning there, and maybe we'll kick things off in New Zealand with Gordon Russell, where I think it's more like 8:30 in the morning. So Gordon, big thank you for joining us today. I'm sure you've seen a few curveballs in your 3 decades at Esk Valley. Normally for winemakers, it's the weather that keeps us on our toes, but I can imagine 2023 were quite a different curveball. Maybe you can describe for us how the lockdown unfolded in New Zealand and how that impacted your harvest over there. Do we have Gordon there? Maybe you're on mute, Gordon.
He's on mute.
Sorry, that's better. You'll hear me now.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, so obviously, I mean, you're correct, Ross. You know, I mean, no one's ever seen anything like this, but we had a bit of luck in our harvest here in Hawke's Bay, well, across New Zealand, and given that it was the earliest harvest that we'd ever had. So we confronted Covert near the end of harvest. So we had to scramble to find solutions, and we had 1 week effectively to find a way of working around what was going to be a nationwide lockdown. So initially the industry did not know whether we would be categorized as an essential business. If we weren't, we would all be staying at home and the harvest would effectively end. So the industry as such lobbied the government to create an opportunity for us as an industry to, in Hawke's Bay, complete our harvest, and in Marlborough to, you know, literally start their harvest and get through it as they could. So we had 1 week, and we were confronted with a situation where we had our red wines out on the vine. Most of our white wines were either in ferment or nearing the end of ferment. What I did effectively within that sort of 1 week period of not knowing what was going to happen, everything that I possibly could add, say, that had finished fermentation, I added PMS to. I filled the tank in the understanding that if I walked away and came back within 6 months later, that I would still have wine which would be safe and a sellable product. In hindsight, that probably wasn't necessary, but it was one thing I wanted to point out to you as a group. I think it's a year of playing safe potentially with your wines, trying to get, you never know what's going to happen in the next few days, whether you're going to get an infection into your winery or into the region and lockdown becomes severe. So you need to, I think, try and take a safe and smart approach to wine rather than pushing the boundaries potentially. So we had a week to look at how we could keep COVID out of the winery and keep processing. I'm talking here about a 5,000 tonne winery as well. So Esk Valley is now part of a sort of larger cooperative Villa Maria owned winery. We run 2 12-hour shifts to process our harvest. We decided that it was best to split that into 3, and the understanding that if one of the shifts ended up being infected, the other 2 could cover it. Is the sort of smartest way that we could see to guarantee potentially that we could continue the harvest. Each of those shifts, well, I'll go back slightly as well. We looked at every individual involved in making wine at the harvest, whether when they went home or into, you know, whether if they went home, whether they were being put into a situation where COVID could get into their household as such. So New Zealand was going into a lockdown situation, but essential workers could go out and sort of mix with other essential workers. My own circumstances, my wife was working. As it turns out, that meant effectively that either she gave up her job or I gave up mine and couldn't come into work. Because me being in contact with her, being in contact with others, put everyone at my workplace into a sort of, hazardous or contagious situation. I made the decision that I would stay at work for 1 month. And what the company did effectively was review everyone's circumstances, divide us into 3 shifts, and those that had to stay at work were provided with motorhomes. So the company ended up getting 30 motorhomes, which were brought to site, and each of the shifts had like an encampment of motorhomes and our own shower, recreational facilities, toilet facilities, and so forth. So we were all totally kept separate from every other shift. Our day was split into an 8-hour shift. The last half hour of each shift, we would finish work. We would absolutely sterilize the winery, the smoko, the sort of lunchroom facilities and so forth. But in reality, we had our own separate lunchrooms. The lab where samples were taken, samples would be left outside for the lab to then go outside and take it into the lab and sort of avoid contamination. We looked at every part of our processing and aimed to keep COVID out of it. It was remarkable what we achieved in a week. And I'd have to say this comes with huge expense, but the alternative is a greater expense.
Yeah, that's amazing how little time you had to just basically change everything in your business. It's incredible.
Yeah, I noted sort of just a few things to say, at the end it was like with the big learnings. One was communication, to tell every staff member how important it was for them to be on guard and just, relaying that information. And also, no one had ever confronted a situation like this, so everything about this was new, and everyone's input into this was valuable. But we had a full-time health and safety officer who was monitoring industry trends, was liaising with government, liaising with head offices such in Auckland, Villa Maria, which would shut down effectively. Just that communication is probably the most important thing of all.
Okay, so just a note, Gordon, if you could just be a little bit further from your microphone, there is just breaking up a little bit. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
So in terms of managing the harvest between the vineyard and the winery, obviously grapes have to get delivered to a winery. How did you manage that? And were delivery drivers even allowed on site?
Right. So in the end, because there was sort of some haste, we thought to get fruit off the vine, and like I said, we were lucky. It was such a good harvest and such an early harvest. We set about machine harvesting most of it. So it was only very rare instances where we utilised any hand picking. But machine harvesting, we as a company own 3 harvesters. Basically, they were running 24 hours a day. There were 2 12-hour shifts there actually, where one driver was effectively, they had their own machines and then be totally decontaminated before the other one hopped in. Truck drivers weren't allowed out of their trucks. Any delivery drivers bringing anything onto site, and that included courier drivers. We set up a little shed, effectively, that was removed from all winery buildings as such, where the courier driver would turn up. No one was to come in contact with the courier driver. Any deliveries of yeast or winemaking supplies would be dropped in that shed as well. They'd be decontaminated and then brought onto site. We avoided all human-to-human contact with anyone outside, effectively, the winery bubble. And each shift was regarded as a bubble as well. Okay.
So obviously you had your motorhome camp for all your staff. One thing that I've definitely been on my mind here, our harvest crews tend to enjoy the social side of harvest and going to pubs and parties. So how did you any tips for keeping harvest staff amused if you're trying to keep them confined, I guess?
Well, we, as I said, I mean, we had a collection of motorhomes. There were 3 different encampments, and, you know, while one was sleeping, one was working, I suppose one was having recreation, and so we effectively never crossed, you know, a social time or whatever with any of the other crews. We were not allowed off-site. So we were basically trapped effectively within the estate. So we were fed 3 times a day. The company provided, you know, plenty of beer and recreational opportunities and so forth. It was always, you know, we didn't care what liaisons in some respect were enacted between people on the same shift. It was just trying to keep that shift safe from the other shifts effectively. So that was just, people bought into it. I mean, they understood. It was out there. It was effectively, COVID was spreading. Where we were was a safe environment, and focus became making wine. So it's an incredible commitment that you're asking people to do, but effectively there is no alternative.
Yeah, that's right. How big was your crew, Gordon, for harvest?
Each shift was, I'm guessing that there was probably about 10 of us living on site from each shift.
Okay.
I mean, there were some who were travelling home every night as well, but they were going home to a lockdown household who, you know, maybe the wife and the children and so forth were having no contact with anybody else. So it was effectively going home to a safe environment. If you couldn't guarantee that safe environment, you would stay at work.
Okay. So in terms of workplace sanitation and distancing and stuff like that, we're getting into the groove here in BC, but we're about to approach our first harvest. Was there any pinch points at harvest you found where you just couldn't keep people distanced, or any sanitation issues that popped up that you weren't expecting?
Well, see, bear in mind, this was at the beginning of the whole pandemic as such as well. So we, you know, face masks weren't really, weren't utilised at that stage of the pandemic like it is now. So no one had face masks. But in terms of hand sanitisation and so forth, we had stations everywhere, and people were wearing gloves. So it was gloves, sanitisation, and social distancing. You know, those effectively were our tools. So we, I suppose, just got into the groove. I mean, there was all handrails. Each shift had half an hour that they took out of their day at the end of each shift, like I said, to sanitise all the handrails, all the equipment, any shared facilities as such. But in reality, like I said, also there were no shared facilities because there was different toilets and bathrooms for each shift. you know, different lunchrooms and so forth. So I suppose we're in a bigger winery here, and with a lot of space, which potentially allows us to do this. In a smaller self-contained unit, maybe 5-10 people or something, it's going to be harder, I would suggest, but everyone just has to take that responsibility that they are keeping it, you know, keeping the virus out of that working environment.
Yeah. Okay, Gordon, thanks again for joining us, and hopefully you can stick around for our Q&A session at the end of this discussion.
Sure.
And yeah, some great info there. And a reminder to the audience, please feel free to send your questions through via the chat function to Mary, and she'll ask them on your behalf. So yeah, with that being said, let's switch over to Tasmania and talk to Jeremy. Jeremy, thanks for getting up so early in the morning. I would think that Tasmania down there in the Southern Ocean isn't a bad little spot to be if there's a bit of a pandemic going on, much like New Zealand. And as Mary said, I see the borders closed for, is it the rest of the year?
Until December 1st at least.
Till December 1st, so yeah. Looking back at 2020, can you tell us how you were impacted by COVID in Tasmania and what control measures were put on place by your local government?
Yeah, so look, I guess a lot of what Gordon said is echoed here in Tasmania, so I won't try and cover the same ground again. But I guess the big differences for us, we had already started harvest, or we're just at the beginning of harvest, and we are quite a bit smaller winery. So we might appear larger than our staff base suggests. We crush about 2,500 tonnes, but of that, over 2/3 is just breasters juice and then out. So we make about 1,000 tonnes here on site. So we've got a relatively small crew. Then we bring in about 8 to 10 interns for harvest. So like Gordon, we do 2 12-hour shifts, but we didn't really have enough people to split that into 3 shifts. But because this all happened like right at the beginning of our harvest, there weren't a lot of government protocols in place. There wasn't a lot of really good advice. So we were, I guess, playing it on the fly. The Tasmania had one of the early serious outbreaks in Australia. So there's a town about an hour to our west that had an outbreak in the hospital, which spread quite widely. So that caused a pretty serious lockdown in that region, and we actually process grapes for a couple of vineyards in that region. So that made their picking even more difficult because they couldn't bring pickers from outside the area. The transport of those grapes into our winery, there were no real protocols for this at the time. So we really had to work out how to deal with that, how to make sure that the truck drivers stayed in their truck, that there was no transfer of physical paperwork. So it really was a pretty challenging start to the vintage for us. And one of the biggest challenges was very much like Gordon said, the uncertainty, because we didn't know whether we were going to be classified as an essential industry. We didn't know whether our interns who come from around the world would be allowed to stay or required to move on, and we really didn't know how long this was going to happen and what the restrictions were going to be placed on us.
Okay. You mentioned the no handing over of paper and stuff like that. Can you perhaps give some other examples of how you use technology to limit contact points between people with paper, and other ways you use technology to beat COVID or to hold it away?
Yeah, look, again, we're not the largest winery, so we don't have a huge amount of IT available to us. But fortunately, all of our winemaking software and record keeping is largely online, and it's not just cloud based. There's a phone app, so we can actually record. Whether it's vineyard observations, whether it's laboratory analysis, or even operations. Like I can go from one tank to another and use my phone to actually record the transfer. All the dips, any additions, that can all happen digitally. The most difficult part of that is when you're getting deliveries, whether it's fruit, whether it's winemaking additives or what have you, from off-site. There's not really a standard interface for somebody to digitally transfer you a document unless they email you a PDF. So that was one of our biggest troubles, dealing with stuff digitally. I guess like S Valley, our head office is not on site at the winery, and we traditionally have a very old school method of put your signed documents in a document wallet, and 2 or 3 times a week that gets transferred back and forth to the head office. But our administrative staff weren't classified as essential workers, so that transfer stopped. So it forced us to move all of our internal documents online. All of our invoice approvals, everything was PDF or another form of electronic transfer. But then getting back to the actual the paper, obviously we were making sure our staff weren't signing any paperwork that had been delivered or touched by truck drivers or other people coming into the winery. But we had to think of all of the little things, like we had to make sure that people weren't even sharing pens within the winery. Fortunately, we mostly use pencils rather than pens, so we had boxes of like 200 of them at a time. So it didn't really matter if people went through 10 pencils a day. But it's all these little things that you don't think of at the start of something like this that really can not just add cost and complexity, but that do contribute risk.
Yeah. Just getting back to labour shortages a little bit. Obviously, you're probably starting to think about your second COVID harvest now coming up next year, and the world hasn't really opened up for travel very much. Is this a big concern for you or your region or Australia in general? Is that something you're thinking about now, and what kind of solutions are you coming up with for that?
So we've actually been thinking about this for quite some time, because we were quite severely impacted during the lockdown. So what I didn't mention before is of our sort of 9 interns, I think, that we brought in this year, 4 of them left within the first few weeks of harvest, which is essentially half your harvest crew leaving the winery, which we can't blame them for wanting to return home to whether it was elsewhere in Australia or France, but it really did place quite a big impost on the remainder of us, and it actually changed how we had to manage what we had planned to manage as well. But for those of you who are not familiar with Tasmania, we are an island off to the south of Australia. We are, I guess, the Newfies of Australia. So we're quite isolated. We're often the butt of jokes, but right at the moment, we're probably the envy of the rest of the country, because we are essentially COVID-free, and we have a pretty substantial water border. We've got 260 kilometres of water between us and mainland Australia. So that's all well and good. We're all nice and safe here, but we normally bring in people who've got at least a couple of harvests under their belt, so experienced people to help us run the vintage, and that's probably not going to be available to us this year. So we're looking at how can we train local staff, how can we potentially shut our packaging down during harvest, which is something we did last harvest anyway because of COVID. We didn't want the staff on the packaging line, like who are literally cheek by jowl, we didn't want them packaging in that environment. So we're thinking of retraining them to do some of the cellar work, drive the forklifts, receive the fruit, and looking at what other options we can do internally. I think fortunately our harvest this year is going to be a bit smaller than last year, which will make it a little easier. But yeah, the other big issue for us was in the vineyard. We use some backpackers, some local refugee labour, and some other contractors. Some of them didn't feel safe. They didn't want to come and work in a vineyard, particularly when you've got a picking crew of 40, 50, even 60 people at a time. So we had to put in temperature measurements. So everybody had their temperature remotely sensed as they came in. And there were a bunch of things that we didn't think about right at the start. Like a lot of these staff would share transport in. So you can potentially have one infected or ill staff member who can then be the transport mode for another half a dozen, and all of a sudden, because one member's got a cold or needs to self-isolate, the rest of them can't get there.
Thanks very much for that. I think, yeah, I got a couple more questions, but maybe we'll just move on to Steve now and get them later in the Q&A session if we've got time. Unless Mary,
Sure.
you've got any? Do you have any questions for Jeremy? No. Okay. All right. Thanks very much, Jeremy. We'll get back to you shortly.
Welcome.
And yeah, we'll move on to Steve Marino. Thanks for joining us, Steve. Maybe you can start off by describing your role at WorkSafe BC and any specific COVID-related areas that you and WorkSafe have been working on in the last couple of months.
Well, thanks, Ross, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to participate today. It's really important for our agency to be able to get out and, well, not get out, but be able to outdo this type of outreach work. You know, one thing I want to get on my soapbox right now and just say, you know, everybody's doing their best to protect the health and safety of people, not just workers, but clients and family members, but just pay heed to the mental health issues associated with the pandemic right now. It's taken a real toll on a lot of people. So you have to take consideration for what's going on out there and in your workplace, and keep an eye on your staff because some of them might be suffering. My role with WorkSafe BC is well, we call them prevention field service officer, or I'm an inspector for the most part within the occupational health and safety world. But our mantra is consultation, education, and enforcement. So we have to have a balance of all of it. Enforcement doesn't work without doing some of the consultation and education type of work. With respect to COVID and the pandemic, it was just more or less business as usual for us throughout, right up until about April, where I was spending a fair bit of time out on farms and whatnot. And then we basically got pulled out of the agriculture world, and I was put into inspecting areas where we don't normally get into, such as restaurants, bars, schools, fishing camps, levels of municipal government, fire departments, you know, the bylaw officers, tanning salons, medical, all that kind of stuff. We were basically tasked with inspecting these places, as well as getting into some of the farms when there was a complaint, with looking at their COVID safety plans and providing guidance. So for several months, we basically put on that consultative and educational support role or hat to get out and support industry to move forward, open up BC, get people working, but also keep them safe. So most of our work was reviewing COVID safety plans, looking at control measures that were implemented and how that rolled out to the workers. That happened probably for May, June, and July. And then we shifted more back to our normal focus, which is supporting agriculture. But a lot of our work recently has been responding to complaints. So we are doing planned inspections, but we are buried in complaints right now. Complaints are coming in from the general public. Complaints are coming in from workers and other agencies, such as bylaw, public health, various ministries, police, and whatnot. And most of the complaints are with respect to physical distancing, a lot of complaints with respect to mask use and not use, but we're also getting a lot of health and safety related concerns, such as the right to refuse unsafe work and what that looks like within the COVID-19 situation. So most of the stuff that we are reviewing a lot of our work right now, and we're seeing that there's a real high level of compliance, or at least trying to do the right thing. What I'm finding a lot, say, especially in the agriculture sector, where we've got varying business units. So we've got the tasting, say, for example, a commercial winery, we've got tasting, we've got processing, administration, retail, and we've also got fields. And the COVID safety plans tend to have been focused primarily on what the active business of the day was. So tasting room and wine shop, and nothing for the field workers. We'll figure that out once we get more active towards harvest. Well, that's sort of, you know, when we look at what Gordon and Jeremy went through, all of a sudden now I'm in harvest and I have to implement all of these control measures, right? We've got an opportunity here in listening to what's happening down in the Southern Hemisphere and the roles that WorkSafe BC, AgSafe BC, and the Manufacturing Safety Alliance have, is to give everybody the opportunity to plan and get through harvest in a manner that workers' health and safety is protected and in compliance with the regulations, but also keeping workers happy and safe. This is going to be a tough year this year. Things are going to have to be a little bit different. It's going to be difficult with the lack of workers and some of the changes to the designs or the planning that has to be done. So that's sort of where we've been right now up to this point. But we will be actively out there in industry doing our inspections and looking at the COVID safety plan is the first thing.
Yeah, and I was about to come back to that. So can you just run through, obviously it's an employer's responsibility, can you just run through what that COVID safety plan should include and any other employer-related responsibilities that we need to be aware of?
Sure, yeah, I know, Ross, you sort of seeded me with a couple of topics, and the COVID safety plan is the working document that employers need to have in place. The template's available on our website. It's a fillable PDF. It is, or you can print it off. And basically, they call it a 6-step process. The primary objective is for you to analyze and assess your workplace to determine areas of risk. Classify that risk, whether it's high, moderate, or low, looking at where potential transmission could occur, and then implement controls on to minimize or eliminate. It's similar to risk assessments you'll find in all sorts of different industries with respect to, say, confined space or explosive atmospheres and whatnot, but they've eliminated the substitution part because you can't really substitute a harvest for something else. So you'll go through the process, you'll assess your workplace, look at areas where you may have worker transmission. Then you look at what protocols or things do we have to implement to keep that potential transmission at bay with respect to some of the, what areas are maybe the highest risk, such as workers are in close contact, or you have workers coming and going that you don't know what's happening when they're in their non-work life, right? So from that risk assessment and implementing your controls, you want to some things like elimination, number of people, occupancy levels, how can we physically keep two people or people 2 meters apart. Then you're going to look at, well, the next level is barriers. Do we have to put barriers in place if we can't, physically keep people apart? Then from that point forward, if we can't implement barriers, you also have to, even if you can implement barriers, you still have to create rules and procedures and guidelines for people to follow. Within those policies and procedures, you have to think about health monitoring as well, and checking on your staff to see whether they're unwell and whether they're actively in high-risk environments outside of work. And then we get down to personal protective equipment, which is the mask or the respirator issue, which is a real big topic of conversation. We're getting a lot of inquiries on that. So as we go through the COVID safety plan, you develop your policies, then you got to look at communication and training. How are we getting the information out? And how are we training people to the information? In the policies and procedures, you're looking at your sanitization or sanitation processes and cleaning. And then you need to have an update system. It's a fluid document. It's not fixed. You have to be able to change it, modify it, and whatnot, because as you'll see, certain things might not work. Some things may be a heavy burden. Some things just may not, you may need to increase some of your protocols. And then as you go through your operations, you're constantly assessing what you're doing. So there's a lot of industry-specific resources available on our website that you can,
I was about to mention that actually.
Right.
The WorkSafeBC.com. Maybe Kate can share her screen on the homepage for your website, because it's pretty easy to navigate and find your way around.
What we did was we tried, because it's a timely topic, COVID-19 is the big topic du jour. So that's basically on our banner. If you look at the top, returning to safe operations, it lists all of some of the big type of industries. Then in the resources, you'll see the COVID safety plan template. There's a whole ton of things. And sometimes it's good to look at what other industries are doing. So you may look at, I've got a winery, but I have to look at the offices section or the personal services section or retail. Commercial wineries have a whole host of different type of business units. Some have accommodations, right? So you may have to implement a COVID safety plan for your guest houses. And you may have other things happening. So there's a ton of resources. And then the health and safety agencies that are available to you, such as AgSafe BC and the Manufacturing Safety Alliance, have done a tremendous amount of great work to help employers navigate the labyrinth of WorkSafe BC and what we've got. We've got, sometimes we can be information overload. So those agencies have really brought the goalpost in and put together some really good things to help people in your industry.
Yeah, it's fantastic. That's WorkSafeBC.com. So we're a little short on time, Steve, but I do want to ask at least one more question for you.
Sure, please do.
Exposure control plans.
Right.
So I don't think that is actually a requirement for wineries to have it. I think it's more the domain of healthcare workers, healthcare facilities and places like that. But is there resources available for wineries if they do have an infected worker, or is that something they can be thinking about now in advance?
Well, two things we'll think about is the ECP, the exposure control plan, is currently not required outside of anywhere where there's going to be confirmed or presumptive cases due to the nature of the work, like you mentioned, healthcare. But think of your COVID-19 safety plan as your exposure control plan, right? And in there, your health monitoring procedures, if a worker reports signs and symptoms that are, flu-like signs or symptoms, direct them to 811. But there is also an app available through the CDC through 811 that you can do a self-assessment through an app to tell you whether you need to isolate or go get tested. And we've also got the COVID safety plan available as an app for the various type of smartphones or other applications as well. So you can actually do your COVID safety plan through an app.
Okay, that's great. One more quick question for you. So the use of masks, it's something that seems to polarize people a bit. They are widely used, but they're not mandated yet. Are employers required to provide masks if they're requested by workers? I guess that's a good place to start.
Right, okay. Masks, the mask itself, the surgical type mask is not really considered personal protective equipment. The N95 type or the face sealing respirator is considered personal protective equipment. Masks, these surgical masks are a barrier. Generally, they're not required unless your COVID safety plan has determined that you at no time can keep people 2 meters distance, and there is a potential for exposure because those workers are not in a pod, a work group, a cohort, or however you want to call it, right? So thinking of your high-risk areas such as sorting, your sorting tables, where workers may be side to side. If those 2 people are independent living off property, masks will probably be required. A worker that requests a mask or demands a mask, you're not required to give them one unless your COVID safety plan identifies that they're at risk. All I'm trying to communicate to everybody though is you need to think about that person's, why are they asking, right? And maybe it's a good idea to keep them there to support a worker who has concerns. They're gonna probably end up calling us. But if you give them a mask, it will alleviate some of their stress and anxiety, but the mask does not give them the permission to now get into people's faces. So the mask is to protect them, well, actually to protect other people from them, but it doesn't now mean that now I can go up and breach that 2 meter distancing requirement, right?
Okay. Thanks very much, Steve. I don't think I got halfway down my list of questions, but hopefully we can get back to a couple of more at the end.
Sure.
Mary, do you have any from the audience for Steve? Nope, nothing. Shake of the head. So yeah, thanks, Steve. Steve's a great supporter of the BC Wine Grape Council, and certainly appreciate his commitment and expertise to our Health and Safety Committee in particular. So. Now we'll move on to another great resource for us, Ron Maciborski from AgSafe BC. Thanks for joining us, Ron. And maybe, like Steve, maybe you can just tell us a bit about your role and some of the COVID-19 related projects you've been working on recently. Do we have Ron there? You might be on mute, Ron.
Yes, am I?
There we go.
Here we go. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it. It's an eye-opener listening, having listened to Gordon, Jeremy, and it's always an eye-opener listening to Steve. Little background: AgSafe. We've been very active. It's been busy times for us. AgSafe has been around for 27 years, and we've really developed into an organization that has primarily education and training roles. We try and mirror much of what WorkSafe BC does. We're certainly not in the enforcement of WorkSafe BC regulations. We work hard to assist in compliance, and we've worked hard to create, and I've got to put my hand out to the head office in creating some of the resources on our website. If we get the opportunity, and Kate can bring our website up at the end of my presentation, there's just a couple of areas I would point out. Training mandate is really one that we received from WorkSafe BC. It goes all the way to core certification. We really specifically have had most of our work in the last 4 months based on orientation, primarily orientation for new workers, temporary foreign workers largely, and you in the vineyards know how important that is to your operations. Our orientation has expanded considerably, double the time, because we have created what we're calling our COVID training. And using WorkSafe BC resources, using the resources that our team has put together on our website, we've really spent a lot of extra time making sure that the temporary foreign workers have a good handle on rights and responsibilities with regard to COVID. They are a pretty responsible lot in terms of self-assessing in meeting the sanitation requirements that have been set out. And the starting point was very early on when the application for authorization to bring temporary foreign workers onto the property through Interior Health and the provincial government set out a checklist of some 34 questions. By creating as many of the signs and other resources required to put that application into place, which incidentally was always followed by an inspection. So workers were brought on after completing the documentation and after an inspection. The fortunate thing is that in British Columbia, to my knowledge, there have not been outbreaks with that temporary foreign workforce in any of the vineyards. There have been issues in nurseries, and nurseries have lots of issues because of the proximity that is so hard to control. We've really conducted extended COVID training from that authorization to the point where really what our focus is now is the WorkSafe BC safety plan. Much of what we did early on created the ability to look at the safety plan and say, okay, it's done, you've done this, but it's a good reminder to review it, to monitor, to look at, as Steve put it, the fluidity of how things have changed. We are very much on the ground. One of the things that, and I travel with a translator most of the time, one of the things that we have to say is, you know, we're kind of the wild cards, because here we are going into safe places and we're coming from outside. We certainly have some pretty strict protocols and self-assessment tools that we have to use before entering. We've eliminated the paper exchange altogether, for instance. I will do my training records, photo them, and then send them in electronically rather than hand paper out, either to the employers or certainly in contact with any of the workers. But we definitely, you know, feel that moving into that situation, not part of the problem, we're considered essential workers, but extremely cautious as to how we have to handle ourselves. Going on to the next step, which is the question about the course, the picker course. I just highly recommend that picker course. If anyone hasn't had a chance to look at it, it was developed fairly quickly. It was really developed in response to requests from the regional district, and Interior Health. They were concerned about the 300 site Loose Bay picker campground, and the conditions there were just nowhere near what was required under normal circumstances, let alone under COVID. RDOS, regional district, was concerned about liability issues. The provincial government stepped up and financed considerable upgrades. I think the most important thing they did is they hired a COVID coordinator on site. And that COVID coordinator role is something I'm going to encourage on every single site in every vineyard. Have someone who has that role so that it's not totally on the supervisor's shoulders, but is distributed or focused on someone who has access to the tools and resources. So the campsite, again, to my knowledge, at Moose Bay, nor the big one in Creston neither of them have had any kind of outbreaks, either within the camp or with the workers who have gone out onto particular sites. The Creston cherry growers contacted us at AgSafe very early on, and they were 3 to 4 weeks behind the fruit picking requirement in the South Okanagan. So that gave them a bit of a head start to get things up and going. And they went to the point of hiring, not only at their large camp, a COVID coordinator, but actually created a position for her as a COVID coordinator trainer. So she reached out to all the cherry growers in advance of the pickers even arriving and put them through a coordinator training program, which I thought was brilliant and was pretty effective. The course itself is available. It's in English and French. I think that to understand the purpose of the course requires getting familiar with the industrial camp order from the provincial government, which came out and indicated that a coordinator had to actually be put in place. It also required for camps, those of you in the vineyards who are using pickers in camps or drawing them from existing camps, there's an inspection required of your camp if it's on your site. And those inspections have been taking place on a regular basis. Those inspections were not WorkSafe BC inspections, but were Interior Health, I believe, or provincial government, but they did conduct those. There was an application required.
Yeah.
The course.
Sorry, Ron. Just related to the COVID-19 training course for pickers, COVID awareness course. Maybe Kate can bring up the website, which clearly has a link to that one. Just a quick question. Sorry to interrupt you. Just a quick question. When we have harvest workers coming from different pods or different teams, how do you suggest we manage them in the field to limit the risk? Do you have isolation protocols to keep teams apart that you'd recommend?
We do, to some extent. And first thing I'll say is that pods work. They really do. What it does is puts a requirement on you to, if you go back to courses, you'll see that the courses, including the picker's course, I'll just go back as she's scrolling through. There's an online version and there's an in-person version. I'll talk a little bit about that and then go on to pods. Because most of the pickers don't have access to a computer or a laptop, we're recommending do the in-person. The in-person is a 14 or 15 page PowerPoint. You can print it off and have them sit down and go through that. It really is a requirement before they're allowed on the farms. It's quite thorough. I really admire, again, AgSafe's staff in Langley who put this course together on pretty short notice, but it really hits on many of the questions that you've put to us at AgSafe and some of the questions that you would put to WorkSafe BC. Okay. Use the in-person version and get a sign-off, because if you do the online, you get a certificate, which you can carry with you if you move from farm to farm. If you are doing the in-person, have a sign-off, make a copy of it so that if a picker moves from one vineyard to another or one farm to another, they can give evidence that they have gone through the course.
Okay, that's great. Great resource. So it's agsafe.ca.
Right.
agsafebc.ca, sorry.
Yes.
So
the COVID-19 tab is pretty easy to find. We really bring it up, COVID-19 information. And again, you'll see both the COVID-19 tab and the courses tab side by side. Okay. Now, the other one that's accessible through the AgSafe website is the safety plan template from WorkSafe BC. And it's right there under COVID safety plan. And if you open up, you'll see, you don't need to open up the links, because under the first one, the COVID safety plan, if I'm not mistaken, yes, the second paragraph says WorkSafe BC has created a template. It can be found here. That's the quickest way to get at the template. And thank you, Steve. I wasn't aware that it was on an app, so I'll look into that and make sure that we distribute that as well. The safety plan is very important, and it's really a tremendous guideline for what you may have done. And many of those who went through our orientation and COVID training have pretty much put themselves in a position where their safety plan is relatively easy to accomplish. Those who haven't are going to have a little bit of work to do.
Okay.
Pods
Yeah,
themselves.
pods, thanks.
Yeah, what they really requires for you as an employer to develop essentially a logistical plan. You've got to look and say, okay, I'm used to having everybody go out all at once and you can't mix there anymore. Can you do it in pods of 6? That's the number. It doesn't have to be 6. For instance, if your temporary foreign workers are housed and there's 8 or 10 of them and they've been in a family or a pod themselves, that group can continue on to work. I think if you can limit the locals or the pickers into and divide them into pods, that's, again, it's a logistical task of assigning them work, assigning them different start times, assigning them different times for breaks and meals. That's really what the pod functions as. And if you sit down and chart it out, it can be accomplished. And I think it's important that you isolate your pickers and local workers from your temporary foreign workers under the guidelines from Service Canada and under all of the efforts that they've done. They're in safe places. If they've been on your vineyard and they're in a safe place and you're bringing others in, the risk factor is too high to jeopardize what you've accomplished with them. You've got to limit congregations. You're, again, protecting those who are in a safe place. You've got locals in the mix. What's your control? It's very limited. What becomes critical, I think, is the self-assessment tool. And there's a wonderful self-assessment tool available on our website in 3 or 4 languages, which can be used twice a day, the beginning and the end of each shift. It puts responsibility on supervisors or the COVID coordinator to determine fitness for duty. That's really kind of an old-fashioned phrase in safety, but fitness for duty and not having any symptoms of COVID are really on the same line. So what do you need to look for? The questions that you need to ask requires possibly you to do your own screening tools. Screening tools are the key for anyone coming in, whether it's a truck driver or a group of local harvesters. Again, with locals in the mix, you can create pods among them. You've got some training, obviously, that has to be done. Insist on the picker course. It talks about pods and gives some assistance in why and how they're useful. It's important that you're limiting visitors. And I guess the public access to vineyards adjoining wineries has always been a concern for us. And, do you have to create a barrier? To some degree you do. You don't want the public mixing with the workers who are harvesting right at the edge of the winery. And it's very common in the Okanagan.
Yeah. Okay,
consult
Ron.
with MSABC on the winery workers, because they're going to have a lot of information that we don't have because we're out in the field in the vineyard.
Yeah, that's terrific information. And again, I don't think we got halfway down my list of questions that I had lined up for you, Ron, but really appreciate the detail you just gave us there. I believe Mary has a question, so I'll give it over to Mary.
Yeah, and this has come up a couple of times, and it's directed towards Jeremy and Gordon. So what people are really concerned about is, I know, Gordon, you talked about sanitizing the harvesters in between workers and so on and so forth. What exactly are you using, or what's your choice of sanitizer? For example, say it's a forklift within the winery where there's a lot of people jumping on and off that in normal circumstances. How were you handling that? And did everybody have to, did you have a protocol for washing hands? Did they all have hand sanitizer? How did you manage this? And then obviously, Jeremy, you talked about using technology for work orders so that there was no paper or that kind of thing. I'm not sure, Gordon, if you did the same thing or not, and how would you do it?
Okay. I mean, good questions here. I mean, our choice of sanitizer, we were just using waste spirit, which was at, 70%, I think. We've got access to it. We just had spray bottles everywhere, quite honestly. I mean, there was a sanitization station probably within 20 meters of every space within the winery. It's funny, it just became second nature that you would always walk by it and you would always use it. I mean, probably excessively, but it just became our first choice of action as such. I don't think we actually thought about paper orders. It's interesting, Jeremy, because we were still issuing them, but bear in mind what we did, which was we had our own sort of pod and bubble. So each of those shifts was totally self-contained, and we were trying to avoid any contact between our shift and the other shift and any visitors, which we, keeping the public out and isolating ourselves from any drivers and so forth was really important. But we had our own pod, which we assumed was safe. So it wasn't necessarily, although we were obviously sanitizing and keeping a distance between ourselves as best we could, our biggest goal was to try and keep us safe from everybody else. So, and I mean, contrary, I think just one thing I wanted to add, just Ron and Steve, I mean, there is so much information there that you, just alluded to there. You've got all the information that you need, which effectively we never had. This has all been developed and post our harvest. I think you have everything at your disposal there. One thing I would say is that although someone mentioned it's a heavy burden, the alternative is worse. I mean, the alternative is that you get COVID into your winery, you're going to have to cease operations and you won't be making any wine at all. So you have to make that decision. The other thing too is that as an industry, I don't think you can let any single estate be slack on this. Once, the government or government industries or whatever find that the industry itself is being slack, that the industry itself has let down the guard, we always were under the assumption in New Zealand that the industry would be shut down. So you have to make sure that what you're proposing, every member adheres to, and no one can let it down for all of you. I think that's important as well.
Thank you. Jeremy, do you have anything to add to that? You're on mute, I think.
Sorry, I'll just echo exactly what Gordon said there. But for us, the sanitizing challenge was probably a little larger than it is for people now. Because we got hit right at the start of restrictions and lockdowns, you couldn't buy any form of sanitizer or hand cleaner for love nor money. It was really difficult, so we were actually even using a tiny little 30-litre still to distill some of our excess wine just to make some 70-80% alcohol just for the spray bottles. But by sort of near the end of vintage, that had settled down, and you could buy a sanitizer. But of course, people were taking advantage of that shortage, and there were some people profiteering. But we did exactly the same as Gordon. We put high strength alcohol in spray bottles. We had spray bottles on every forklift. We had spray bottles dotted around the winery. So we we required people to wash down whatever they were using in between. We weren't able to separate our two teams as successfully as Gordon, partly because we had some people living in the same house who were on different shifts, and we couldn't do much about that. There just wasn't accommodation available. So we did as much separation as we could, but really just focused on actually alcohol sanitization.
Great. Thank you. Ross, is there anything else that you wanted to add, or?
I did have a question. It was supposed to be directed to Steve about transporting of workers and best practice there. Jeremy sort of alluded to the challenges they had with transporting, I think it was vineyard workers from place to place. What is best practice, Steve? What should we be looking at? Because obviously you can't keep 6 feet apart when you're transporting workers.
It's dependent upon the makeup of the workforce, because the interior of whatever worker transport vehicle you have could be large or it could be small. So when we look at the elimination or the barrier requirements, can you eliminate a center seat to keep people 2 meters apart? Possibly not. Is the makeup of your staff the family living unit or the worker pod that Ron alluded to with respect to housing, or you're in your camp? Are you moving those core workers that are working together and living together? If not, then you have to look at in your safety plan, you have to make sure that you implement procedures, right? You may have to look at those masks. You may have to limit the number of people that are in the vehicles. So, because again, the mask is only generally to protect other people from the wearer, not necessarily protect the wearer from other people. So you may have to look at shuttling. Instead of 20 people, you may have to carry 6. That's if your worker group is not considered a work pod. So there's a lot that you have to, as Ron mentioned, logistics, right? Everybody's going to have to become a expert on logistics now and planning, right? So that's kind of how it looks.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll let Mary, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. We've gone a little bit over time, and I appreciate the time of all our panelists for sure. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I know there's a lot more questions that we could ask. Gordon, Russell, I really appreciate your time getting up and spending your morning with us. All the information you gave was great. Jeremy, even earlier from you, and it's good to see you again, Jeremy. It's been a long time since I've seen you. And nice to meet Gordon for the first time. I've heard of many things about him. Ron and Steve, fantastic information. You've given us the places to go and what we need. Ross, of course, great job, and thanks for getting all the questions together. I would like to tell you that we have been recording this session, so we will be putting it up on the website, the BC Wine Grape Council website, so that you can listen to it again. You'll probably get some more information each time you listen to it, or if you want any of your employees to listen to it, I think it's a good resource. And just keep on that website, because there'll be updates all the time. So I'd like to thank everybody who participated in this, and we will stay safe. Thanks a lot, everyone. And that's all we have for today.